Assalamu alaikum, dear believers. I want to welcome you to this beautiful but cold Sunday afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Taleem on this day. I want to, on behalf of the Taleem Committee, Dr. Aisha El-Amin, Dr. Gloria Bashir, and Sister Rashida Fitzpatrick, welcome you to today's Taleem. The topic is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And today we are honored to have with us one of our dear brothers and members of Masjid Al-Taqwa, Bill Chambers. Bill Chambers, as I said before, is a member of Masjid Al-Taqwa and a member of the Muslim Anti-Racist Collaborative. He's a full-time activist with a long history of civil rights, anti-racism, anti-war, Irish Republican, and Palestine solidarity work. As part of his activist work, Brother Bill has traveled extensively to Ireland and Palestine to meet and work with community organizations. He has published multiple articles for the Muslim Journal, Muslim Matters, Electronic, Intifada, Palestine in America, and the Chicago Monitor on Islamophobia, surveillance of Muslims and social groups, social justice groups, Palestine solidarity campaigns, Black Lives Matter, and the movement for community control of the police. Bill is the author of the Muslim American Fight for Social Justice, From Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter, and Huwara Watercolors, a book of poetry and photographs from his trips to Palestine. We're so honored to have him today. We know that we are witnessing a very unfortunate situation in Palestine. We also know we have to acknowledge that we have been being bombarded with a deluge of information, a lot of it misinformation. So we're excited to have our dear brother with us this afternoon to give us a broad overview of this conflict, to really anchor us in some of the history that we're not always aware of, and to give us the knowledge that we need to make sense of some of the things that we are being exposed to and some of the things that we see on social media. So thank you, Brother Bill, for being here with us, and I want to go ahead and turn it over to you, inshallah.
Jazakallah. Thanks very much, Dr. Lionel, and for the Taleem Committee for inviting me to share some of my experiences in Palestine and, as you say, try to break through a lot of the misinformation and that's really been coming out about Palestine for many, many years, but we're even seeing more of it now. One of the things to be clear on is that, well, first, assalamu alaikum all, and thank you for joining me and Dr. Lionel on this very, very cold day. This is going to be a two-part Taleem, so I'm going to cover a lot of issues. One of the things that I like to do when I do presentations is put up some questions that, by the end of the two Taleems, that you should be able to answer some of these, or at least have some background and knowledge about this. You often hear, Israel called an apartheid state. In fact, you'll probably during this presentation hear me call it apartheid Israel. Why is that? And we're certainly going to go into some detail about that. And then what is settler colonialism? Not only my view, but the view of many people is that the situation that we have in Palestine really is an issue of settler colonialism. And we're going to talk about the broader history of Palestine and how we got to this place a little bit later on. One of the things that people are usually often very surprised by are prisoners, including children, tortured. As you probably might expect, the answer is yes. and we'll be talking about that in some detail. And I was able to interview some of those people when I was on my trips that we're going to talk about in a minute. A real big one is a two-state solution possible? That's been talked about for a long time. The latest from Blinken and President, President Biden is that their plan is, well, whenever this Gaza war ends, they would like to have a single Palestinian state and also a single Israeli state. And their idea is to have it control the Palestinian state controlled by the Palestinian Authority. So we'll talk about how that's completely impossible and that most people haven't thought a two-state solution has been possible for many years. One of the other things that you hear, particularly now with the war on Gaza, does Hamas want to end the Israeli state? I mean, the one that's the question in back of that is, well, does Hamas really want to kill all the Jews? And you'll hear that repeated quite often by people that are in the news. So we're going to address that question. And the last one, actually, this, how do you apply the Islamic rules of warfare to the war on Gaza? I have to give Dr. Ramadan credit for this one. There was a khutbah that he gave probably 3-4 weeks ago now. And for those of you that were there, his khutbah was on Gaza. And he did a particularly effective one with all the different players in Gaza, the Israeli settlers, the US government, the Palestinians and Hamas and so on. And if you get a chance to listen to it, definitely see if you can do that. And in fact, we worked on a article kind of version of that for the Muslim Journal. So that might be coming out in the next issue, but look for that. But one of the things he did, he went through some of the, not only the Geneva Convention international rules, but also the Islamic rules of warfare. And how would you go about applying those to the war that's going on right now in Gaza? And as most of you know, the Quran is very specific about what is allowed and what is not allowed when you are in a warfare situation. So we will talk about that. So how we're going to do this is, I thought it would be much more interesting to talk about my experience in Palestine first and go through some of those personal experiences I had. And much of that, and we'll talk about the trips that I took to Palestine here in a minute, but much of those experiences, to be blunt, have only gotten worse. I mean, the various conditions and the things that I saw from reading and talking to people that have gone over there more recently, none of the conditions or the conflict has gotten any better. So we're going to start with that, and then we're going to go back, and I think we hopefully will get to this part today, a little bit about Palestine history. How did we get to this place where there's an Israeli state and there's Palestinian territories, and that's where we'll be talking about settler colonialism. And definitely next time we'll go in detail about the war on Gaza, and that you'll see a lot of the emphasis on how the media is twisting a lot of the things that are going on, and it's very hard to find sources that you can read or listen to that are really telling the truth about what's happening. So I'll be sharing some of those sources next time. And then overall, what are the conclusions? What can we draw from all of this? And most importantly, what you can do. That's the very last thing that we'll talk about next time. But it's very, very easy. I know my wife Elaine and I, sometimes just get completely overwhelmed by what's happening. I mean, I've had to update the number of people killed and the number of people injured like every day, in this presentation. Um, so it's very easy to, like I said, to get overwhelmed. This is such a big thing. There really isn't anything I can do. That's not true. There's a whole number of things you can do. So, and part of one of the first things you can do is be part of this kind of program where you get educated on what's really happening. So I took four delegations to Palestine. This was from 2009 to 2012. So this was about, a little over 10 years ago. And these delegations were part of a group that I was a part of called the Palestine Solidarity Group in Chicago. And the delegations were teachers, students, activists, lots of different types of people from all over the country. And our intention was to bring people to Palestine to really see what's going on. And because even myself, and that's one of the reasons I call this my first trip of reality, I read plenty of books and watched the news and listened to people talk about Palestine. But until you actually go there and are just confronted with the reality of the apartheid system and the wall that they have and this military occupation, it's, even for somebody like me, it was pretty shocking. I mean, I was just fairly overwhelmed. So the idea of these delegations was to have people go there, see what's really happening, and then come back and be better informed activists, to be either part of our group or some other group to fight for self-determination and human rights for the Palestinians. The group I was in we did a lot of different, I'll probably tell you next time, this is the fifth war on Gaza. So this has happened multiple times before. So we were usually involved in doing protests, and we did some boycott, divestment, sanction work with things like Sabra hummus and other Israeli products. One of the campaigns we had was called, and you might not know this, but Chicago has a sister city in Israel. It's called Petah Tikva. And one of the things that we found out about that city is that it's a very, very well-known, huge detention center. And like most cities in Israel, it was built on top of a Palestinian village that was destroyed. But it was very ironic that we chose the city that was basically a huge jail that you'll hear about later when I talk about people being tortured and put in administrative detention without any evidence and so on. So we were involved in a lot of these different activities. The second trip I took was meeting with Adamir, and Adamir is a political prisoner support group. And on that trip, I went with a lawyer from New York, and our whole purpose was to gather information on political prisoners, interview people, bring that information back to the U.S. To see what we could do to support the political prisoners that were there. And Adamir is an organization that supplies lawyers and represents them and tracks torture and things like that. The third trip was after I said my Shahada. And I'll say, unfortunately, it was shortly after I said my Shahada, because one of the things when we talk about this trip, it was the first time I was a Muslim coming into Israel, and I had a paper that whatever, said that I had said my shahada with a witness and everything else. But often you can't bring any material with you that would make you suspicious. Why is this old, white bearded guy? And when we search his luggage, and he's a Muslim, like, okay, why is he here? You don't want to do anything that gives them an idea that they might want to question you. So I'll tell you about my experiences there, and during that trip, and it's a situation where there's a lot of restrictions being put on Muslims uh, going to Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Dome of the Rock. So you'll hear about some of that. Then the fourth trip, my son was involved for about 2-3 months during the summer with a nonviolent resistance group, and I went to join him. And I don't want to give you a lot of detail about this, but one of the reasons that I didn't go back after this fourth trip of this particular delegation, the FBI decided that that our group and another group we were involved in were doing these delegations supporting, providing support for terrorism in Palestine. And of course, we weren't doing anything of the sort, but somehow they were convinced that we were doing that. And they actually had an informer on the trip. And the funny thing was, though, that the particular informer, I was usually somebody who got in very quickly because my whole persona was the old white, Catholic guy that had my book that said, looking and touring the Holy Land, and I want to go to Bethlehem, and is that safe? And I had this whole routine because if they thought I was part of the delegation, they would just send me back. So the informant was with another person from Minneapolis, and I was in the airport and I waiting for people to get off planes and stuff like that. And then I heard, oh, okay, they stopped these were two women. They stopped these two women. And I did get the experience of calling the embassy in Israel because I was figuring, well, wait a minute, they're not the U.S. embassy in Israel. They can't stop us. We're American citizens. Blah, blah, blah. Well, you very quickly realize, which I did when I called the embassy and said, well, wait a minute, these two women, they're just coming here to see the Holy Land, whatever. And, why are they in detention at the airport? And of course, the response I got, well, the Israelis have control over the border and we really can't do anything about that. Okay. And they ended up what the Israelis would do if there was some reason they didn't like you were a person of color. It almost didn't matter where you were from. They would question you. If you were Palestinian, they absolutely would question you. Or if you came in with a group and it wasn't some, evangelical Christian, whatever, they would also question you. And if they thought you were suspicious, they would detain you at the airport and send you back to wherever you came from on the first flight. So out of all this, there was a grand jury that was formed and a whole number of people, not including me, that were given subpoenas to appear in front of the grand jury. And after about a year campaign, no one ended up, everybody refused. It was given to like 12 different people. Everybody refused, and the whole case kind of collapsed because, well, they didn't have any evidence, because that's not anything we were doing. But that gives you an idea of the kind of oppression that the FBI and other, Department of Homeland Security still do against Palestinian activists. And obviously, I don't have to tell you all about, organizations that the FBI has harassed and surveilled. But the Palestinian support movement is also one of those. Okay, so let's talk about the first trip where I had that reality pushed in my face here. Um, One of the things that I found in doing some evidence gathering and research for this presentation is that, and maybe somebody that's on the phone here was part of this delegation, that in 1996, Imam W.D. Muhammad made a delegation to Palestine. He was invited there by Yasser Arafat, who was the president at the time. And of course, guess who was the prime minister? Netanyahu. So even back then, when that delegation went, when the Imam toured, in fact, he toured just about every city that I'm going to talk about here. Um, and if you want to see, there's a terrific 30-minute news report on the Imam's delegation to Palestine. It's on the Muslim Journal site, and it's very much worth watching. Because the thing that happened to me when I watched the various comments and what happened to them in the places that the delegation went, I had the same experiences. And, my experiences are, well, this was what, 28 years ago. And then my experiences were, a little over 10 years ago, but really nothing had changed. Like a good example is one of the things that the Imam and the people with him noticed that there were IDF soldiers all over, particularly around Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that's one of the things that I noticed when I first came to Jerusalem. Al-Quds is the Arabic name for Jerusalem. Um, at any entrances to the old city, particularly the control points that go into where the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque is, are all controlled by what we call them the Israeli occupation forces. Um, and and they commented during the video about, these are just young guys, and well, young guys and men and women, with these live rounds and these automatic weapons. And in fact, when I was in Jerusalem, the other group of people that they didn't comment too much on their trip was you see settlers walking all over the place, and there's no such thing as concealed carry. Because I wish I could find this one picture. One of my favorites in kind of a sick way, I guess, is this picture I took of this guy. He was a settler. He had probably a Kalashnikov or some kind of automatic weapon on one shoulder, and in his other arm he was holding a baby and walking along. He's just walking along the street in Jerusalem, and and it's that kind of thing. Not only the soldiers but also the settlers. That's all intimidation. I mean, that's all that is. Because part of East Jerusalem is the Palestinian part, and then West Jerusalem is the Israeli section. And since the Imam has been there and has continued to the present day, there's more and more parts of East Jerusalem that are being taken over by the Israelis. So, as an example, well, let me stop there just for a second. So you can see when I was there were continually, you see these new like condos being built like near the old city and that kind of thing. And a lot of those were taking over previously Palestinian homes. And some of those condos, it wasn't like people were living in there year round. These would be condos for probably rich Jewish people who were coming to visit or whatever, and then they would have a beautiful condo, very modern condo for them to stay in. One of the things that a couple of the other things that the Imam mentioned, and that they mentioned during that trip, was that they had a black Palestinian who was their tour guide, and he had been in prison and so on. And they said that there's a comment. Well, the Israelis don't accept Ethiopians or like Ethiopian Jews, for example, or Black Americans as settlers. And they didn't say it directly in the video, but I'll say it directly. It's because Israel is a very racist state. Um, as part of the first trip, there's a small community of um, Ethiopian Jews that are in. They're in this. It looks like what we would call a slum. You know, it's was one part of like a neighborhood of Jerusalem. And I remember talking to one of the people there who was more politically active and protesting this kind of treatment. And he said, "Oh yeah, they call us all kinds of names. I think the Arabic. I think there's an Arabic name. Some of you can probably correct me. Where sometimes you'll find Arab Muslims. They'll call African Americans or Black people Abid, which I think means like slave. Well, this was whatever the Hebrew version of that was. So it was very, very clear that they were treated as, I mean, they certainly lived there and they were citizens, but they were treated as second class citizens, had very few rights. And there's been other periods of time when large number of Ethiopians might try to come into Israel to settle, and then they're just deported. You know, they're just not allowed to do that at all. One of the things that I was impressed by is that during that tour, that delegation of the Imam Muhammad's, was they participated as part of a protest. And one of the things that really hit me, that one of the people at the protest said, "Help us, Imam, let people know what's happening." So even back then, 28 some years ago, um, supporting the Palestinians and being part of this effort that we're doing now, even in having this Taleem, is really part of the community. And this is something that's been going on, that the Imam certainly was a supporter of the Palestinians. Now, the house that you see on the left, as I mentioned, a lot of the houses in certain neighborhoods just get taken over by the Israelis. So the way they take it over, you can see there's a big long Israeli flag and a bunch of small ones. And even this house, it's most likely just that above part of the building that the settlers are occupying. And it's very likely the bottom part of this building, there's still Palestinians living in there. And when I was there, there's a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah that was very well known for the Israelis trying to take over these people's houses. And they would wait until, let's say, the people that were living there like left to go shopping or whatever, and they would just move in and just throw all their stuff out. There was an older grandmotherly woman that we interviewed, and the settlers had moved into the front of her house. So she had this back part, and she talked about, you know, they always had to make sure they left somebody in the house so they didn't come and take over. But, you know, she would talk about walking through, just going out into the street and getting yelled at and abused and, you know, verbally abused. And so this kind of stuff was going on when I was there. And it's just continued. It's really the Israelis trying to take over as much of Jerusalem, and particularly East Jerusalem, which is where this neighborhood is, as they can. Now, the picture on the right is one of the settlements that are all over the West Bank. This particular settlement was outside of Jerusalem, and you know, you drive by and it looks like you're in Florida. You know, you can see the palm trees and these very fancy, beautiful condos, and they have swimming pools. Yeah, and if you compare them to, let's say, a Palestinian village, that would be nearby, and we certainly went to a number of those, um, you're not going to see any kind of buildings like this. And typically, the very, very permanent um, settlements, like the ones you see here, it's usually up on a hill. So there'll be Palestinian village down below, and they have their farmland, which is typically outside the village. And what the settlers do is they start off with a few tents or whatever on top of the highest point that looks out over the Palestinian village. And then they start building, larger and larger buildings. And I'll be talking about this later on another trip, where the settlers, they'll just come down from their settlements that are up high, and they'll burn crops or cut down trees. And the only thing I could think of comparing it to, it'd be like if you were in the, I don't know, you were in some neighborhood in the South or in Chicago or whatever, and the Ku Klux Klan decided that they were going to, either invade the first front of your house, or they built their building, their houses on top of a slight rise that was near you, and they spent all their time harassing you and making it hard. I mean, this kind of stuff, as you can tell, it's been going on for a very long time, and it's still happening. There's 500,000 settlers in the West Bank, and we'll talk about later how it got to that point. So the next city we visited was Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is very, very near Jerusalem. So if you look at the picture on the left, Bethlehem is completely surrounded by what we call the apartheid wall. And you can get an idea with the picture on the right, how high that wall is. It's got to be, I don't know, 25 feet high, something like that, and has these concentration camp towers that, I would describe that if you look at the windows up above, they would definitely have soldiers in there, depending on what city it is. And we'll talk about Hebron in a minute. They would have people up there with weapons, making sure you weren't getting too close to the wall or so on. So when the Israelis are very good at, you'll hear a lot of evangelical Christians, or just, I don't know, regular Christians or whatever, will go on trips to see the Holy Land. And what they'll do is, they'll come to Jerusalem and take them to the Israeli part of Jerusalem and show them some of the Christian sites, which they keep up very well. They let all the Palestinian areas kind of go to ruin, and they don't spend any money or anything on them. But once, most Christian visitors would want to go to Bethlehem, so they put them in a bus, and we'd see these buses go by, and you can't miss the fact that there's this 25-foot concrete wall with barbed wire at the top, as you're going into the city, because you have to pass through a checkpoint. But what they would do is, everybody from the bus would get off and go to the Church of the Nativity and see where Isa, or Jesus, Prophet Jesus, was born. And then they'd get back on the bus and just leave. Well, one of the reasons they did that is because Bethlehem is part of the West Bank that's, I was going to say, controlled by Palestinians. It's supposed to be controlled by Palestinians, but it's like somebody saying, okay, we're going to give you all this land, see all that land and that picture there, and you have total control over that. Oh, by the way, we're going to build a 25-foot wall all around you, so you'll have to talk to us if you want to leave, or if you want to bring in something, or so there's all kinds of businesses and everything around the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, but those are all run by Palestinians, so they don't want any visitors or anything to actually go talk to a Palestinian. That would be a terrible thing. So one of the um, one of the other cities that we went to see, and actually, as I mentioned, Imam Muhammad also went here, is Hebron. Now, Hebron, and it's Al-Khalil is the Arabic name. Hebron is the site where Ibrahim or Abraham, his wife Sarah, is buried there. So the Ibrahim Mosque that I mentioned right below there is where it's called the Jewish people call it the I think it's well, they wouldn't call it a mosque, but the synagogue of the patriarchs. That this is where the patriarchs of the Jewish religion and also of Islam are buried. And there's a mosque on that particular site. One of the things, if you look down below, I'll explain what this picture means. So that Hebron is a large Palestinian city. There's 215,000 Palestinians there. And right in the middle of those 215,000 Palestinians are 500 settlers. And the settlers in that particular location are, as they are in many, are very, very violent. And this pathway that you see in this picture, this leads to the area where the settlement is. So if you see the really kind of bright light at the end of the street there, that's the start of the settlement. It's very, very new and has a big wall around it and so on. And the buildings above, what these are on either side of this picture are shops. They used to be Palestinian shops where they would sell all kinds of goods and that kind of thing. And then right above them, where you can kind of see the brick starts looking a little newer, there's really settlers living above those shops. And that was another example where, and this is in the very center of Hebron, where the settlers took over Palestinian homes. I mean, there were Palestinians living above these shops. And the reason you see that ceiling of it's like chicken wire and there's a bunch of rocks and everything else. Well, if you're a Palestinian, you walk down this street, and there are some other Palestinian houses at the end of the street, not just the not just the whatever you call it, where the settlers are living, the settlement. There would be people above who would throw rocks. They'd throw feces and urine, and they would just harass all of the Palestinians that might try to walk through there. So eventually, it got so bad they had to put up that particular barrier. And it's given an idea how violent I mentioned the Ibrahim Mosque massacre in 1994. There was an extremist settler who came in, and this was during the 15th day of Ramadan. He had an automatic weapon and killed 29 Palestinians and injured 150. And there's still some settlers who glorify this Goldstein, I think it was his last name, this settler who did this. And ever since then, they have basically at the entrance, there's a bunch of soldiers, and they decide whether you're a Muslim or you're somebody that's going to go into the Muslim side of the mosque, or the other side, which is where the Jewish people go, or whether you're going to go over there. And on the trip that we were on, we had a woman, Sarah, who wore a Jewish Star of David, and she looked like a typical Jewish person, but she was very, very much pro-Palestinian. Well, they wouldn't let her go on the Muslim side. They kind of forced her to go on the other side. And she ended up being terrified because the other side spilled out into the settlement. And we waited around because we were wondering what the heck happened to her. And she came back and said, I came out into the settlement and there's all these people walking around with guns and trying to talk to me, and I just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. So that's the kind of extremely tense type environment that you found there. Now, Nablus is a very large Palestinian town. It's kind of known for its resistance. In fact, the picture on the left, it's a little hard to see, but there's pockmarks on the wall of that building. This is another area like Bethlehem that is supposed to be in control of the Palestinians, but the Israelis come in there with, tanks and soldiers and pretty much anytime they want. The person that you see in the wheelchair on the right, a lot of times people say, well, why don't Palestinians try doing nonviolent resistance? I mean, why does it always come to violent resistance? Well, the Palestinians have been trying nonviolent resistance for many years. And the issue with that is that they're met with violence. So in this case, this was the mayor of Nablus that we interviewed when we were there. And he, at one time, a number of mayors, like the mayor of Bethlehem or Hebron or Nablus or whatever, got together and tried to enforce their rights, that, to keep the settlers off their land or out of their city or whatever it was. And some Israeli, probably a settler, put a bomb underneath his car and blew his legs off. So, they trying to use nonviolent pressure, at least here internally, has never really gone very far. The last picture there on the right, you can probably tell it's a very old mosque, and this was a completely demolished Palestinian village that was outside of Nablus, and there wasn't anything left. It looked like it was going to be taken over as a park. Israelis do often take over the Palestinian villages that have been completely destroyed, and they make them into parks and name them after people. Well, in this case, every other building was completely destroyed. I mean, it was just a field with rocks everywhere, except for this mosque. And the person that gave us the tour was part of a group who used to live in that village. And they used to come there to the mosque, on Fridays to do Juma, and you can probably tell at the bottom of the picture, there's barbed wire. So even them coming back to a village that's been completely destroyed and isn't even there anymore, they don't want these people coming back there at all. They certainly don't want them coming back to this mosque. So this particular mosque was completely surrounded by a bunch of fences. Okay, on the second trip that I mentioned that I took to Palestine, this was one where I went with with a lawyer, and we were, as I mentioned, we were gathering information about political prisoners and working with that group, Adamir, that I've worked with for a very long time. These are the most recent statistics, and you can see, and these are political prisoners. I mean, these could be people throwing rocks at a tank. It could be, in particular, when we talk about the administrative detainees, and I want to talk about that for a minute. Administrative detainees are people who are arrested under military law, and that's the other thing that's important to understand. All the Palestinians that whether they live in Gaza or the West Bank, are under military law. So there is no, what we would imagine like American legal system or whatever. So all the judges are military people. They follow military orders. So if you're an administrative detainee, you could be somebody that was at a protest at the wrong time, and then they would arrest you, and then they can keep you for 60 days. And at the end of the 60 days, you go in front of a military court, and often they would just keep you for another 60 days. So they've had people that are there, have been there for very, well, multiple years. And they don't have to show any evidence because it's national security, and they don't have to provide any reason at all for why you were arrested. Now you notice the number of female prisoners, but particularly the number of child prisoners. Israel doesn't recognize, typically anyone who's under 16 is considered a child in international law. Well, Israel is one of the few countries that doesn't recognize that at all. So there'll be people who are, 14, 15, like I said, maybe they threw a rock at a tank, or they were at a protest, the wrong place, the wrong time, and they would be arrested. Now, this is also very different than we know, like my brother Zaki, for example, works at a juvenile detention. I'm sure that's not the right word, but a place where there's juveniles that have gotten in trouble with the law. Well, in this case, they're put in with all the adults. I mean, it's not like there's a separate prison. They separate male and female prisoners, but child prisoners, they're in with everybody else. And we, while I was there, we talked to a young woman who was 15 when she was, it's either 14 or 15 when she was arrested. And excuse me. And the reason she was arrested, this was during one of the kind of uprisings, and they were, the Israeli officials were very nervous. She had friends in the West Bank, and she lived in Israel. Like, I think she lived in Jerusalem, for example. So she was a Jerusalem citizen. She made a call to her friend in the West Bank, and they arrested her. It's like, well, you're talking to some Palestinian in the West Bank. You shouldn't be doing that. And they arrested her, and she was in jail for a number of months. Very proud of her because she ended up starting a hunger strike while she was there. But going back to one of the questions I had in the beginning, prisoners are absolutely tortured, whether they're children or not, in these detention centers. In this description that I have here, this is the most recent description from Al-Amin, the organization I was talking about. And there's a lot of different types of torture. On this trip, we interviewed a whole number of people. And like, just as an example, there was the Supreme Court Israel decision when it looked like some of the torture was getting out of hand, and people could see that people were being beaten and stuff like that. And they said, well, you can't do that anymore. Well, now they do things that don't show up. Like, one positional torture is like the banana position, where your hands and feet are tied together and you're leaned over a chair and just left there for hours. So they would do that type of thing. Or psychological torture, if you're a child, they'd say, unless you tell us about your friends or whatever, we're going to bring your parents in here, and we're going to throw them in jail. A lot of that going on. And in the past, the Palestinian Solidarity Group that I was in, we did tours of Al-Amin people, and they would meet at churches and different places and tell people about this going on. And can you imagine? I mean, hearing that children and other political prisoners are being tortured. I mean, this is still going on, and nothing's really done about it. I'm going to just talk briefly about the third and fourth trip, because I want to leave some time for questions here. I mentioned a little bit that I was a Muslim visiting Al-Quds, that the freedom to worship there is very much under threat, and part of the reason is there's an extremist group in Israel that believes that they need to blow up the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque to build the third temple, to build the new temple for the Jewish people, and that'll also encourage the Messiah to come sooner. So almost every Ramadan, you hear stories about the Israeli police or army like bringing Jewish people into this area because actually they're not supposed to be in that area at all. In fact, this last Ramadan, they had a lot of fighting, and they were shooting tear gas at worshipers and that type of thing. And at the time, it was very embarrassing for me because I hadn't learned all the prayers and how I was supposed to make salat and so on. And so I was able to pray in the Dome of the Rock, but they didn't like how I prayed. Probably didn't do the right number of rakats or something. And they said, "Well, we'll let you go in Al-Aqsa Mosque, but don't pray there, because if anybody kind of sees that you're not praying right, they'll probably throw you out." And I was kind of like, "Oh my gosh!" But I understood why they took that position, because they couldn't let anybody go in there. This is the third trip, and this doesn't mean anything other than some of my favorite pictures of Al-Aqsa Mosque. So I just wanted to show you how beautiful the mosque is. This is at the very end of the mosque with the stained glass window. It's just a gorgeous building. This is another part of the arches that are along the sides of the mosque. So even though I didn't get to pray there, it was a really emotional time for me, or even being in Jerusalem. Again, if you ever have an opportunity to go there, it's just to feel all this history, and of course how important Jerusalem is to Islam and so on is just overwhelming. I'm just going to mention a couple things on this. Let's go back to the previous one on my last trip, and then I'm going to leave. We've got some questions. As I mentioned, I was supporting my son in some nonviolent resistance. And the scene you see here, and this is what this group was trying to do, as I mentioned, settlers were often up on a hill. And in this area, in this particular village, they would come down from the village, and the village was growing grapes. And they would just burn all the grapevines. And often, or they would cut down the hundreds of year old trees. So the settlers and the Palestinian farmers were always getting into conflict over that. And usually people like us, or the people from the international community, would be there to try to protect the farmers from these settlers. So I'm going to stop there. We don't have a lot of time, but we have some time for questions. I'd like to see if anybody has some. And then next time we'll talk about some more history and talk about Gaza. So does anybody have any? Stop sharing my screen here.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Bill.
Hi, Brother Rod.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I wanted to ask you, as part of your presentation and as part of many, many years of conversation about a two-state solution, which seems to be more and more unlikely, but it's still promoted, particularly in America and in the Western world. If a two-state solution is not the answer, based on your experience with the, politically within Ireland and your visits to the Palestinian territories, what would you see is the solution to that problem?
Yeah, well, that's often when you get to the point of trying to seeing what the solution should be, in terms of justice for all the people involved. I mean, I always talk about there should be a one-state solution, and it should be a democratic, secular state where, you know, Palestinians and Israelis have equal rights. That's what the solution should be, because at this point, there's so many settlements all over the West Bank, and Gaza has been just about completely destroyed, that there's no way a two-state solution is even possible. Now, how you're going to get there is the biggest issue, and I think I've probably talked to you before maybe about it. And when you compare it to Ireland, the biggest issue is that there are not strong leaders on any side of this conflict. I mean, you can even look at like South Africa. De Klerk, you know, during apartheid South Africa, he was pushed into a position of giving up the apartheid system. Well, there's nobody leadership like that in Israel whatsoever. And of course, in the Ireland case, the U.S. was kind of an independent observer or whatever, and could. Well, right now, I think what needs to happen is the U.S. needs to step back and obviously stop supporting Israel, but they need some other group like the UN or a group of Arab states or whatever to try to actually have some kind of negotiations. And if you're going to have negotiations, just like in Ireland, you have to include everybody. And you can keep calling, you know, Hamas and the terrorists all you want, but they need to somehow be part of any type of solution, and that's never happened. So those are just a few of the things that I think need to happen for that ultimate solution. I think that's the only one that's going to satisfy everybody.
Thanks for that.
Sure. Other thoughts, other questions? I don't know if there's anything in the chat. Bashir has put a lot of good international law pieces in here. Yeah, that's one of the things, and thank you for that, Brother Bashir. Yeah, we'll talk next time when we talk a lot more about Gaza, to really compare the, as Dr. Ramadan did, compare the international rules of warfare under the Geneva Conventions, which certainly Israel has broken all of those. But the Islamic rules for war are even more strict and more comprehensive. So, we'll talk next time about how those are being violated, you know, what part of those are being violated by Hamas, and also certainly which of those are being violated by the Israeli state. But I think we're about a little minute after 2. Anybody have any other thoughts or questions?
Well, I did. Assalamu alaikum, Aki. This is Ismail. We was just here listening, and it was and I really enjoyed what you had to say about what was going on over there, and being there. Yeah, no doubt. You know, and all the pictures and what have you. I was thinking, you know, I had a cousin that lived there, you know, with the Hebrew Israelites, and he passed away over there. I wanted to ask that question about the Hebrew Israelites there. Did you see any of them, or did you know about any of them being drafted into the military?
Yeah,
you know anything about that? Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I know that every citizen of Israel is required to serve, I think it's 3 or 4 years in the army, but then they would make exceptions for, like, for example, the very strict Orthodox Jews who actually don't believe in Zionism and don't believe in being part of the war, so they don't have to serve. I do know that they would not allow Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel to serve because they don't trust them. And to specifically answer your question, I can only guess that they probably would not want him in the army, given the amount of racism and poor treatment of any. And it sounds ridiculous to say this, but it's like any person of color. Well, if you're Palestinian, you're a person of color. But from their point of view, if you're black, you're African. It's they're really racist, and they really don't want you part of the government or part of the army. So I'm guessing he probably didn't have to serve.
Well, I'm just talking about. I was told that they were being. If they wanted to, stay where they was at over there, some of them was going to have to, if not whoever would be making available to serve in their military.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah,
it is. It was. That's why I wanted to ask you, since you had been there.
Yeah, I certainly didn't see a lot of the soldiers that you see are pretty much, and this has kind of changed over time, are Eastern European Jews, like could be from Russia or Bulgaria, Romania,
right.
that
and they're
that
young
area.
too, right? A lot of them are young.
And they're very they're very young.
That's how they post. That's how they get them. They don't have real.
And they're very dangerous too.
Of course.
We had people pointing guns at us when we were in Hebron, up in one of those towers. They didn't like it, the fact that we were taking photos, and they kept yelling something at us. And we were like, "Oh, I don't understand Hebrew." And we finally had to get out of there because they were coming down the stairs and going to grab our cameras.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Bill.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm curious how are the Ethiopian Jews treated?
Not well. No, they're not treated well at all. And there was, and this was probably a couple of years ago. There were a number of Ethiopian Jews that wanted to. In fact, I think they even wanted to settle in the one desert area. I can't remember the name of it. And this was Netanyahu was still prime minister. They didn't want them there at all, and they were deporting them. So I think this was more like a newer group. Because like I said, we did interview some people who had been there for a very long time, but this was like a newer group that wanted to come to Israel. Just like people are migrating all over the place now. And it was a new group that wanted to come into Israel and said, nope, we don't want you here.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you will get into it next time. This is excellent information. Just for next time, I'm interested in what we can do beyond marching here.
Oh yeah, I got quite a few things. I think Brother Bashir,
yes, I just want to make a brief comment in the area of a one-state solution, and as Muslims, in any decisions that we're making, we should make those decisions based upon the Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. Look at those areas first. And I was recently reading in Quran and in Surah Al-Anbiya, the prophets, in 92 and 93, it says, "Indeed, this community of yours is one community, and I am your Lord, so worship me alone. But the people of their own accord cut asunder the one creed into many religions. They have all to return to us." So Allah has pointed out to us in the Quran that we are one people and we had one creed. And I think that's a strong argument when we appeal to situations like we see in Palestine among Jews and Christians. And we are one community, and we believe in one creator, and the Jews say they do also. That's one beginning of that situation. And the Imam had pointed out to us that many of the problems that we have currently in this world is due to religion and misconceptions that are in religion today. And anytime we're looking at situations like this too, we have to look at ourselves also and make sure that we are in the correct position in our Islamic principles and standards. Of the arguments that those who oppose the Palestinians and Islam, they try to claim that Islam is against Jews and Christians and that we want to destroy Jews. And this concept is incorrect. It's not the correct. And even some Muslims, the Imam pointed out, have taken that position that if they don't accept Islam, then they are your enemies. And when you have Muslims with that position of mind, and you're trying to come to an agreement, then that particular principle in itself is incorrect. And if the Jews are taking a strong position like that, then you cannot come to an agreement. I'd like to point out just one other thing, and I'll be finished. The Imam pointed out to us too, in that situation in Palestine with the Israelis, and he pointed out when Allah says, when you see a wrong, the strongest thing you can do is remove it with your hands. The next strongest thing to do is to speak out against it. And if you're not able to do that, then to that wrong, to have it in your heart that you dislike it. Now, he said we're not supposed to be, he said what that points out to Allah, said we're not supposed to be suicidal. If we're not in a position to be able to remove it with our hands or even to speak out against it, Allah gives us that option. So we have to take all of this wisdom and guidance when we're making these decisions and observations. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks very much, Brother Bashir. Yeah, those are extremely good points. And I'll kind of end this. We've kind of gone over time, but to talk about a single state solution, we need to remember that at one time there was a single state, and the single state was Palestine. And certainly during the Ottoman Empire and after, there were Jews and Christians and Muslims living very happily side by side in Palestine. And even while I was there, I remember talking to some of the people in Nablus that are ways away from Jerusalem, and they said, yeah, we used to go down to the markets because, some of the Jewish markets had some of the best dates or whatever they had, and we would all mingle together. Well, maybe we should be talking about going back to the single state solution where everybody was respected, like you talked about, and like the Quran says. Okay, on that note, I think we're going to finish up, and next time we'll talk a little bit more about the history of how we got here, and we'll talk about the Gaza war. And to your point, Dr. Gloria will talk about what other things you can do other than just marching. Okay? Again, thanks very much. I really appreciate your attention, and inshallah, we'll see you next week. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.